Hello, this is Mr. Gideon. So how does supply change? Well, just like with demand, you need to understand there's two different ways that this phenomenon can change. One is we can slide from one point to another along the curve, and as the price that prevails in the market for the supply of that product or service changes, the quantity supplied will also change. So in this example, once again sticking with coffee beans, we could slide from point A to point B as the price changes, and then of course the suppliers adjust to the change in price by adjusting the quantity that they are willing and able to supply. Once again, the key word is quantity, and that does not mean the same thing as a change in supply. When we say a change in supply occurs, we're talking about the entire curve being redrawn. If it's an increase in supply, it's going to be drawn to the right of the original curve, and we'll label it S sub 2. Your original curve is S sub 1. If it was a decrease in supply, we draw it to the left and label that S sub 2 if it was the second curve for a scenario. But understand there's a difference, just like we had for demand, between a change in quantity supplied and a change in supply. And so, sticking with the coffee example, here's an example of an increase in supply that's more detailed than what we'll use normally, but it shows a bunch of possible price points along with their quantities before and after the shift. Let's go down to the simplified version, which is what we're going to use more often. And as I said before, increase in supply would necessitate a new curve being drawn to the right, decrease in supplies drawn to the left. But what factors cause the supply curve to shift? There's a host of factors, just like we had with demand, that could cause an increase in supply or a decrease in supply. If you're thinking like a seller, which you should when we're thinking about supply, one way that it might help to visualize these changes is to think of good news, bad news a lot of the time. So what are the factors? Changes in the price of relevant resources, changes in technology, the number of sellers, expectations of future price, taxes, subsidies, or government restrictions could also cause the supply curve to shift. So let's just take these one at a time. What about prices of relevant resources? We talked earlier about the 4 factors of production, right? Land, labor, capital, and then the entrepreneur. If you happen to be the entrepreneur, what if the price of one of these other resources, one of these other factors changed? Let's say the price of land that you need to acquire to produce whatever it is that you're going to produce. Maybe you're a farmer. Let's say the price of labor changes. How would that affect your supply? Well, if any of these inputs increase, it gets more expensive for you to operate your company, so your supply is going to decrease. If any of these inputs get cheaper, let's say that you're able to negotiate new contracts with your laborers where they're going to take a pay cut. Let's say you're able to acquire land or physical capital at a lower price than what you're used to, then that frees up your resources to sell more, to put more of what it is that you want to make money on into the marketplace, and that would cause your supply curve to be redrawn to the right. That would be an increase in supply. So those are some examples from prices of relevant resources. What about technology? If technology improves, supply is going to increase and the supply curve is going to shift to the right. If technology takes a step back, deteriorates, proves to be ineffective, supply is going to shift to the left. The number of sellers. Very simple. If the number of sellers of that product or service increase, then supply for that product or service overall in the marketplace is going to increase. If sellers start to leave that marketplace, the number of sellers decrease, then supply will shift to the left because supply is decreasing. Expectations of future price. Now you're thinking like a seller, so this is the opposite of what we had with demand. If you believe as a seller the price that will prevail in the marketplace 3 months from now will be higher, what will you do as a seller today? Will you push more out there? Will you supply more? Or will you supply less? Chances are, ceteris paribus, if nothing else changes, you'll supply less. You'll hold back and wait for that day 3 months from now where you can get a higher price for the same exact thing that you're selling. If you expect prices to decline in the future, you'll probably try to increase the amount of supply that you have today. and so your supply curve would shift to the right. Taxes and subsidies. Taxes, I think you all know what those are, right? This is a portion of your income that the government takes or that you have to send to the government. If taxes were to increase on you as a business owner, that's bad news, and so typically supply will shift left. If taxes decrease, there's a tax cut on you and other suppliers, supply will increase. Supply will shift to the right. Subsidies are kind of the opposite of taxes. Subsidies are payments that the government gives to certain individual companies or industries to help them survive, to help them thrive. An example of a subsidy could be to corn farmers, because the government believes that corn farmers are really important farmers and we want to make them as competitive as possible. We want to encourage them to produce as much corn as possible, not just for the food supply, but for ethanol to put in our cars and so many other kinds of products out there. So we're going to give them money. Maybe we'll give a different kind of business owner money to relocate some of their operations to the inner city, because in these poor urban areas, perhaps, they need jobs, they need economic activity. We'll give them some money. So subsidies and grants are of that nature. What do you think would happen to the supply curve for something if subsidies increase? Supply will shift to the right. It'll increase. If subsidies are cut, then the supply for that product or service that used to get subsidies and now doesn't get any or doesn't get as much in the way of government subsidies will decrease and be drawn to the left. Government restrictions can also increase supply. If the government restricts your company more heavily than it has in the past, typically, ceteris paribus, supply will shift to the left and supply decreases. If they loosen restrictions, they cut the amount of regulation, supply would shift to the right, and the supply curve would be redrawn because of an increase in that direction. Changes in prices of related goods or services are also a factor here that can cause supply to shift to the right and left. If, let's say, A and B are substitutes in production and the price of B rises, the supply of A decreases. If the price of B falls, the supply of A increases. If A and B are complements in production, remember we talked about things that go together. That's what complements are. Then you can see, according to your chart, that if the price of B rises, the supply of A will increase, and the price of B, if it falls, will cause the supply of A to decrease.